What I'm going to do is post this lecture to YouTube. I will then send everybody a link. So if you want to access this lecture, I'll send you the link so you can get to it on YouTube. Okay. I see that no one has their camera on. That's fine. If you are willing to turn your camera on, I would appreciate it, just because it makes it easier for me if I know that there are people on the other side of things that are actually listening to me. You don't have to if you don't want to, but if you're willing to turn your camera on, I would appreciate that. Also keep in mind that on Wednesday's class, remember that we did, you had an extra credit opportunity to add points onto exam 1. That was a 2-part study that you were doing. So you did part 1 last Wednesday. We're still going to do part 2 on Wednesday. We can do that online. So just make sure that if you want to participate in part 2, which you should, there are free points on your exam, then make sure that you're coming to class on Wednesday as well. We're also very probably going to have a top hat quiz on Wednesday, so keep that in mind. We can do top hat remotely, it's not a problem. So just keep that in mind as well. Okay, with that being said, we're going to jump into lecture. So I'm going to share my screen with you guys. So just a reminder as to what we're talking about. We're talking about attribution theories. If you recall, attribution theories are the theories that researchers have to explain how people explain other people's behavior. And so I had just introduced this idea at the end of last class by talking about, or just introducing Kelly's attribution theory, which is an attribution theory that came out in the 1970s, where Harold Kelly, the researcher who came up with this, was interested in knowing how people make internal versus external attributions. So an internal attribution is when we explain someone's behavior in terms of their personality, and an external attribution is when we explain people's behavior in terms of the situation. And sometimes we make internal attributions for other people's behavior. Sometimes we make external attributions. And the question that Kelly's interested in is what determines whether we make an internal or an external attribution. And the basic logic behind Kelly's attribution theory is that people are very rational decision makers, meaning that we collect all the relevant information and we put it all together and we come up to a rational conclusion about why someone engaged in the behavior that they did. So let me walk you through the basics of Kelly's attribution theory. Now keep in mind that this attribution theory is a description of how we come up with internal external attributions. But as we're going to see, we tend to do this naturally. Okay, so you'll see what I mean as I walk through this, that there's a way in which this is sort of common sense in a way. And Kelly is just sort of describing the logic behind how we came up with that common sense attribution. So you'll see what I mean as we go through this. So according to Kelly, when we explain someone else's behavior, and let's use as an example that your friend comes to you and raves about a movie. They love this movie that they've just seen. And so Kelly's attribution theory says that when we explain or try to explain why your friend is engaging in this behavior, why they're raving about this movie, we effectively ask ourselves 3 questions. Now, I'm not saying we literally ask ourselves these 3 questions, but effectively we're using information that we get from the answers that we would give to these 3 questions and combining that information to come up with an attribution. So let's imagine that your friend comes to you, loves this new movie that just came out. Now, there's at least 2 explanations for why this occurs. First off, it could be that they're raving about this movie because the movie is objectively really good, in which case you are making an external attribution for their behavior. You're explaining that they're raving about the movie because the movie itself is good. That's an external attribution. On the other hand, it could simply be the case that your friend has no taste in movies and loves everything, in which case your friend is raving about this movie because due to an internal attribution, because they have no taste, right? So what determines whether you attribute this behavior to this internal cause or to an external cause? Well, according to Kelly, the first thing we do is we ask ourselves what's known as a consensus question. The consensus question is, would most people, other people, behave the same way in this situation? So if you were to imagine that other people in this specific case also saw this movie, do they also rave about this movie or not? Do other people like the movie or not? Now, there's obviously two ways that we can answer this. Yes, other people would behave the same way, other people rave about the movie, or no, everyone hates the movie, but your friend is the only one that likes it. So if you respond yes to a consensus question that most other people like the movie, then we would say that the behavior is high in consensus. It just simply means that other people engage in the same behavior. That's what high in consensus means. And if you answer no to this question, to the consensus question, then we would say that the behavior is low in consensus. And as we're going to see, depending on how we answer these three questions, for each question, we're going to answer it by saying the behavior is either high or low. And depending on the pattern of highs and lows that we get, that's going to lead us to an attribution. A second question that we ask ourselves, according to Kelly, is what's known as the distinctiveness question. Distinctiveness refers to whether this specific person behaves the same way in other similar situations. In this specific instance, what it means is whether your friend raves about every single movie they see. Whenever they see a movie, do they always love every single movie? Or do they normally not like movies? They're kind of picky, but this one they happen to really like. So if you answer yes to a distinctiveness question, that this person behaves this way in other situations, then this particular instance is not very distinctive, right? So if you answer yes to a distinctiveness question, that means it's low in distinctiveness. And this is slightly confusing because if you answered yes to consensus, then it's high in consensus, and distinctiveness is the opposite. If you answer yes to distinctiveness, it's low in distinctiveness. On the other hand, if you answer no to this question, that this person does not behave this way in similar situations, meaning they hate most movies, but they love this one, then this behavior is very distinct. We say the behavior is high in distinctiveness. And then finally, after the distinctiveness question, we ask ourselves a consistency question. The consistency question asks, does this particular person behave the same way in the same situation? So in other words, every time they see this specific movie, does your friend always rave about it? Or did your friend really like it the first time they saw it, then hated it the second time they saw it, then liked it again the third time they saw it? And so if we answer yes to this consistency question, that means that your friend always raves about this movie. Then we say that the behavior is high in consistency. On the other hand, if your friend loves the movie, hates the movie, it's always flip-flopping all the time, we say the behavior is low in consistency. Okay, so this gets a little bit confusing. The way that I remember this is that for the C questions, consensus and consistency, if you answer yes, that means the behavior is high on that characteristic. And for the D question, you get the opposite. If you answer yes, the behavior is low in distinctiveness. But that can kind of be a little bit confusing. Okay, so according to Kelly, before you determine why your friend is raving about the movie, you need to answer these three questions. And so now that you've come up with a pattern of high and low for each one of these three questions, now we've got to put these together to form an actual attribution. And the way that we do that, according to this theory, is in the following way. So if we have determined that this behavior in question is high in consensus and high in distinctiveness and high in consistency, then that will lead us to make an external attribution. So let's think this through for a second. If the behavior is high in consensus, then that means that everybody also really likes the movie. Your friend likes it, everyone also really likes it. If the behavior is high in distinctiveness, then that means that usually your friend hates most movies, but they really like this one. And high in consistency simply means that your friend always raves about this movie every time they see it. And you can tell at sort of a common sense level what's probably happening here. That the movie's really good, right? Your friend is raving about the movie because there's something about the movie that makes it really good. Okay, so that's an external attribution. So that's what I mean when a few minutes ago I mentioned that this is sort of common sense, right? That you don't have to literally ask yourself consensus, distinctiveness, and consistency, but at some level you're putting together that information which leads you to make this external attribution. So Kelly's attribution theory is simply describing what you naturally do at almost an unconscious level. He's saying that you use those three pieces of information to arrive at that conclusion. On the other hand, If you have come up with a different pattern of answers to these questions, then you make a different attribution. So for instance, if you come up with the pattern where you've determined that this behavior is low in consensus, low in distinctiveness, and high in consistency, then we make an internal attribution. So let's walk through this one as well. If the behavior is low in consensus, so your friend raves about this movie, but no one else did, everyone else hates this movie, but your friend really likes it. And if the behavior is low in distinctiveness, then that means that your friend raves about every single movie they've ever seen. And then high in consistency means they always rave about this particular movie. Then you kind of should know what's happening, right? What's happening is that your friend has no taste in movies. They're simply easy to please. They like everything that they see. And again, we can see that that sort of makes sense, because if everyone hates the movie except your friend and your friend loves everything they see, we can tell that it's because your friend just loves everything. They have no taste in movies. So you're effectively making an internal attribution. Now, there are other patterns that you could have come up with. So maybe after asking yourself these three questions, you've determined that the behavior is high in consensus and low in distinctiveness and low in consistency, or something along those lines. Under all other patterns, then the attribution is ambiguous. It's not entirely clear what's happening to us. So it's only really these two specific patterns that we have to really worry about. So let's walk through another example. And the example that we're going to walk through is a question that I could ask on an exam, for instance, something very much like this. So you should make sure that you understand how to do this. Now, when I give you this example, again, it should be pretty clear what's happening without you having to walk through to these individual stages. Like, your common sense will tend to lead you to the correct answer. So just keep that in mind. That, again, Kelly's attribution theory is just simply saying how you're coming to that conclusion at an unconscious level. So imagine the following scenario. Let's imagine that Carmen and John are dancing. John is stepping all over Carmen's feet. He doesn't normally step on a woman's feet when he dances, but every time he dances with Carmen, he steps on her feet. Other men also step on Carmen's feet when she dances with them. And let's say we're trying to figure out an attribution for John's behavior. Why is John stepping all over Carmen's feet? Now, it should be relatively obvious what's happening here. You should, with just your common sense, realize that what's happening is that Carmen's a bad dancer, right? Because other men are stepping on her feet, and John doesn't normally step on a woman's feet, but he's always stepping all over Carmen's feet. It should be relatively clear to you that what's happening is Carmen's a bad dancer. So if that's clear to you, then what you've effectively done is you've made an external attribution for John's behavior. In other words, you've said, John is stepping all over Carmen's feet, not because John's a bad dancer, but because something external to him, because Carmen's a bad dancer. So you've effectively made an external attribution. So Kelly's attribution theory is simply saying that when you came to that conclusion, which we tend to do automatically, you came to that conclusion by including the three pieces of information that we've just discussed. So let's walk through those three pieces of information. First off, you effectively asked yourself a consensus question, which was, do other men also step on other people's feet? Do other people engage in the same behavior? And as we know from this little scenario, that other men do step on Carmen's feet. So you've answered that question, yes, other men step on Carmen's feet. And when you answer yes to the consensus question, then that means that the behavior is high consensus. I'm just reading questions in the chat. You'd be making an external attribution for John, but an internal attribution for Carmen. Yeah, so in this specific question, I'm asking about an attribution for John's behavior, but we could flip it. We could say, why is John stepping over Carmen's feet? And how do we explain Carmen's behavior, why things are going bad? So we could make an attribution for Carmen as well. Okay, so we've asked ourselves a consensus question. Now let's ask ourselves the distinctiveness question. So John is stepping on Carmen's feet. Okay, does John step on other women's feet as well? That's the distinctiveness question. And the answer is no, he doesn't normally step on women's feet. And when you answer no to the distinctiveness question, that means it's high in distinctiveness. Okay, so John does not step on the feet of other women. And then we would ask ourselves the consistency question. Every time John dances with Carmen, does he step all over her feet? Well, we see that in the question. Every time he dances with Carmen, he steps on her feet. We've answered this question, yes, He does. It's consistent. It's highly consistent because John always steps on Carmen's feet. And as we just saw in the prior slide, if you have answered the 3 questions by saying that the behavior is high in consensus, high in distinctiveness, and high in consistency, then that leads us to make an external attribution. Okay, the external attribution being that Carmen is a bad dancer. Okay, so if I give you a scenario like this on an exam, you should be able to break it down in order to answer the consensus, distinctiveness, and consistency questions. And that should line up with your automatic tendency to make an external or internal attribution for that behavior. So when I said a minute ago that Kelly's attribution theory is effectively assuming that we are logical and rational, what I'm saying is that he's assuming that we're gathering all this relevant information, in this case about whether John steps on other women's feet, about whether other men step on Carmen's feet, all this sort of stuff. We're putting together all this relevant information, we're combining it in a logical way, we're coming to a logical, rational conclusion, which leads us to make this attribution. And at the time that this theory came out in the early 1970s or so, this was the dominant idea within psychology, is that people are rational decision makers, basically. As we saw in prior sections, looking at social cognition, though, we know that people don't always make rational decisions. So we saw, for instance, that people have all sorts of biases and heuristics that they utilize, right? And that's because social cognition developed in the 1980s after Kelly came up with his attribution theory. In the 1980s, other research was done on attribution theory, and we started to realize that people, although they can do this, they can make rational attributions. We don't always make rational attributions, and there are many instances in which we are biased. Would this concept fall under deductive reasoning? Effectively, you're basically deducing what the attribution must be based on information. Yeah, so I would say yes. So what I want to turn to now is this idea that our attributions that we make don't always follow this logical pattern, as Kelly laid out here. And I want to introduce this by asking you guys a question. Now you can answer in chat. So if the question I'm about to ask you, if you agree with it, then you can answer in chat. And so just say yes, if, in chat, if you are an asshole. If you're an asshole, say yes in chat. Okay, we got 1, we got 2. Oh my gosh, oh, okay, we got a bunch of ones. Okay, so we got a few in this class. You guys should really be nicer. All right, but I would imagine, okay, there's a bunch of no's now. Okay, let me ask you another question. When you've been driving around Miami, who here has ever accidentally, of course, cut someone off while driving? And I can raise my hand for that one. Yeah, overwhelmingly yes, right? We've all accidentally cut someone off almost, right? Yeah. Okay, let me ask you another one. Who here, while driving, has been cut off? We're in Miami, so I mean, everyone's going to say yes to this one, right? Okay. Who here, after being cut off while driving, has yelled, "You asshole," at the person that cut us off? Definitely me. Okay, almost everybody, right? Okay, so let's think about this for a second. Let's think about this. Let's put all this information together. When someone cuts us off, they're an asshole. We all agree that we yell asshole at the person, right? We've all been cut off. We all call them an asshole. When someone cuts us off, they're an asshole. But when we cut someone off, which we've all admitted we do, very few of us consider ourselves to be assholes, right? So when someone else cuts us off, they're an asshole. When we cut someone off, we're not an asshole. That doesn't seem very fair, does it? In other words, what we're doing here is when someone else is engaging in a behavior, we tend to blame them. We make an internal attribution. They're cutting us off because they're just a horrible person. But when we cut someone off, we don't say we're horrible people, right? We tend to blame other things. It's kind of a bias, right? That's what I mean when I say that our attributions that we make for other people versus ourselves, for instance, can be biased by various factors. And I see that someone has their hand up. Hold on a second. Do you still have a question? I'm not sure if you're able to say anything.
You answered my question. I was just confused about the high and low, but once you did the example and stuff, you answered my question. So
yeah, perfect. Great, good to hear. And the first concept, the first attributional bias that I want to discuss is something that has been considered to be so basic, so common, so fundamental that it literally has the word fundamental in its name, something known as the fundamental attribution error. It turns out that we realized after this had been named, a decade or two after this had been named, that we realized it wasn't quite as fundamental as we first thought. But I'll get back to that idea later on. At least in Western cultures, this is an extremely common attributional bias. Because when you were driving that car and you got cut off and you called the person in front of you who cut you off an asshole, what you didn't know is that person had a baby in the back seat that was running a high fever. And he was taking that baby to the hospital. He was really concerned about his kid's welfare. And not only that, but he had a big business meeting later on where they were going to discuss his promotion. He was concerned that he wasn't going to make it on time and he wouldn't get this promotion. So he was concerned about his baby. He was really distracted. And in his sort of panic to get his baby to the hospital, he forgot to check his blind spot when he changed lanes and he cut you off. But you didn't know that. You just called him an asshole. Or maybe you went to the grocery store and you were buying a bunch of things. You're there with a friend. And as you're checking out, the cashier gives you the wrong amount of change back. And as you're leaving with your friend, you say to your friend, like, what a moron. But what you didn't know is that that cashier was called in on their day off. They're called in at like 6 a.m. So they barely slept the night before. When they get there, the toilets are overflowing. They have to deal with that. They just found out their parents are about to get divorced. That's why they didn't sleep much the night before. So they're concerned about that. And because they had so much on their mind, they miscounted their change when they gave it back to you. But you didn't know any of that, right? You just called that person a moron. Or maybe you're walking down the street after a night out on South Beach and someone bumps into you. And after they bump into you, you call that person a jerk. You're ready to fight them. But what you didn't know is that person had been drinking. They're a little bit drunk. And as they were walking by you, their friend pushed them into you. So that person didn't mean to bump into you. They were pushed into you. But you didn't know any of that, right? You just call that person a jerk. In each of these hypothetical scenarios, what's happening is that you have this tendency to explain other people's behavior in terms of their personality, right? They're a moron, they're a jerk, they're an asshole, whatever it is. And this is what we have a natural tendency to do. This is the fundamental attribution error. It's the tendency that we have to overestimate the dispositional internal influences on other people's behavior and to underestimate the situational influences on their behavior. In other words, when someone else does something, our natural inclination is to explain why they did that in terms of their personality. They did that because that's the kind of person they are. And that bias to only explain other people's behavior in terms of their disposition, to neglect how the situation might have affected their behavior, that bias is known as the fundamental attribution error. And we engage in the fundamental attribution error all the time. If you think about the last time you had an argument with a friend or a significant other or something like that, when we argue, if you listen to the way that you talk in arguments, our natural tendency is to say, you know, you did this to me. That's because you're an uncaring person or you're selfish or you blame their personality. and we neglect how the situation might have led to that other person's behavior. We all do this, right? I can virtually guarantee we've all done this in the past, and we'll all continue to do it much more in the future. Although hopefully now that you know about it, you'll be less likely to do it. But let me talk a little bit more about this in terms of the research that shows the existence of the fundamental attribution error. So in the study, participants were told that they were going to be watching a video of someone who is giving a speech about Fidel Castro. And the speech that they're shown is of a person giving either a pro-Fidel Castro speech or an anti-Fidel Castro speech. Now, the participants are told one of two things. So half of the participants are told that the student that they're watching give the speech chose which position that they wanted to take. What they chose, whether they wanted to be pro or anti-Castro. After watching this video, all these participants then have to rate, what do you think that speech giver, what do you think that person's true attitude is towards Fidel Castro? And in one of the least surprising findings, what you find is that, well, if under these conditions, if you've just seen someone give a pro-Castro speech, then you assume they're really pro-Castro. And if you've seen this person give an anti-Castro speech, you assume they're anti-Castro. I mean, why, if you were anti-Castro, why would you choose to give a pro-Castro speech or vice versa, right? So you assume that if they chose their position, their attitude or the position they take reflects their true underlying attitude. That's just common sense. That makes a lot of sense, right? Well, the researchers were testing an idea in attribution theory. They believed that, although that finding is obvious, well, what would happen if you told participants that the person that they're watching give the speech didn't choose which position to take? They were told they had to give either a pro-Castro speech or an anti-Castro speech. Now, what the researchers believed is that people would behave rationally, right? That was sort of the basic idea in social psychology, that people behaved rationally. And so whether that person gave a pro-Castro speech or an anti-Castro speech shouldn't matter because they were forced to give either a pro or anti-Castro speech. And under those conditions, if participants were logical, you should have no idea what the speech giver's true underlying attitude is. So you should expect, if people are rational, that these two bars, whether they gave a pro or anti-Castro speech, because it gives you no information, they should be at the same level in the condition where they're told the student is assigned which position to take. That's what the researchers believed was going to happen. What they actually showed, on the other hand, was that even though these participants were told which speech to give, they still believed that if a person gave a pro-Castro speech, that they were pro-Castro, and if they gave an anti-Castro speech, that they were anti-Castro. There was still this belief that the perspective, the position that the student had when giving the speech reflected their true underlying attitudes. But logically, it doesn't really make any sense, right? Unless we understand the fundamental attribution error. Because what these participants were doing is they had a tendency to neglect how the situation might have led to the other person's behavior. In this case, we know the situation is what caused them to take an anti or pro-Castro stance, right? Whether the researcher told them to take a pro or anti-Castro stance. But the participants, because of the fundamental attribution error, neglected how the situation could have affected their behavior, and instead explained the observed behavior in terms of the person's attitude, their true underlying attitudes. There's still this belief that that position reflected their true attitudes. So the fact that we still see this gap between these two bars, in other words, that is the fundamental attribution error. Okay, well, how about another study that looks at this as well? So here's what researchers did in this study. They randomly assigned participants to play one of three roles. Now, what they basically did is they put on sort of a fake game show. And participants either play the role of the game show questioner, like the host. The role of the host was to come up with a series of questions that they would ask the contestants on the game show. So the one stipulation, and this is key to the study, is that if you were randomly assigned to be a questioner, you had to come up with questions that you knew the answers to, like general trivia questions. And we can all sort of do this. You can come up with some random questions that you know the answers to, but that's the stipulation, is that you must come up with questions that you know the answers to. Another third of participants were randomly assigned to play the role of contestant. The role of the contestant, of course, is to answer the questions that the host had come up with. Obviously, the contestant's performance is going to be somewhat mixed. They're going to know some of the answers, but not all the answers to these questions. And finally, the third group of participants were randomly assigned to the role of observers. And observers are effectively like audience members watching the game show happen. So they put on this game show. The questioner asks the contestants numerous questions. The contestants' performance is sort of mixed. The observers watch this all going on. And at the end of the game show, everybody, the questioners, the contestants, and the observers, all of these people had to rate how knowledgeable the questioner was in terms of general trivia and how knowledgeable the contestant was in terms of general trivia. Now, we know that because participants were randomly assigned to conditions, that on average, the questioners had the same knowledge as the contestants. That's the whole point of randomly assigning to conditions, is to ensure people are equivalent on all these sorts of dimensions, right? So on average, the questioners and the contestants had the same level of knowledge. However, and I should say, first off, the questioners more or less knew this. That little tiny difference is not a significant difference, right? So the questioners, if you ask them, how much knowledge do you have on general trivia and how much knowledge does the contestant have on general trivia, they correctly realize that they have about the same level of knowledge, okay? So the questioners were effectively unbiased here. However, the contestants were not unbiased. When you ask the contestants about the questioners' knowledge of general trivia, they rated the questioners being really high, and they rated themselves as being significantly lower in terms of their knowledge of general trivia. And if you look at the observers' ratings, they show the same thing. They also rated the questioner as being much more knowledgeable than the contestant. So why is it the case that the contestant and the observers are exhibiting this sort of bias? Why do they believe that the questioner knows more than the contestants do? Well, take the perspective of an observer. Let's say that you're an audience member in this game show, and you're watching this game show proceed, and what you notice is that the contestant gets some questions right and some questions wrong, but the questioner, the host, seems to know the answers to all the questions. Now, we know why that's the case. The only reason that's the case is because the host could only come up with questions they already knew the answers to. That was part of the whole stipulation. So the only reason that the questioners knew more of the answers is because they had to know the answers. Those are the only questions they were allowed to come up with. So if we were behaving rationally, we would realize that, but that's the only reason the questioner knows all the answers, the contestant doesn't. And if we were unbiased, we would correctly state that the questioner and contestant had about the same level of knowledge. But because of the fundamental attribution error, where we attribute other people's behavior to their disposition or their personality or something internal, then when we see that the questioner knows all the answers, we assume that's because they must be intelligent, they must know those things. And the contestant doesn't know the answers, so we assume they must have a lower level of knowledge. So this difference that we see in the contestants' ratings and in the observers' ratings, that is the fundamental attribution error. The assumption that because the questioner knows more of the answers than the contestants, they must be more knowledgeable, and neglecting the fact that that's simply because of the constraints of the study, that the questioner had to know the answers. In fact, the only people who don't show the fundamental attribution error are the questioners themselves, because they realize that the only reason they know the answers is because they had to know the answers when they were generating the questions. They could only ask questions they already knew the answers to. So they realize that's the only reason they seem to know more than the contestants, so they don't exhibit the same bias. Okay, so again, what this study is showing is that among the contestants and the observers, they're attributing other people's behavior to something internal and neglecting how the situation conspired to create this difference. They're neglecting how the situation impacted people's performance and attributing it all to personality and disposition. There are numerous reasons why we engage in the fundamental attribution error. I'll give you a few. First off, we've seen before, and I'd mentioned that this is going to be a general theme that we see again in the class, is that we are limited capacity processors, meaning there's only so much that we can think about at any given time. And it takes a lot of cognitive resources in order to think about how the situation might have affected someone's behavior. If someone cuts you off, it's easy to say, that's because they're an asshole, it's something internal. It's sort of harder to think about all the situations that could have affected why they cut you off. So because we just can't think about too many things at any given time, we tend to default to the easiest sort of attribution, which tends to be an internal attribution. Furthermore, the behavior that we're trying to explain is really salient. In other words, the fact that you got cut off is quite obvious. You know you got cut off. But the situation itself is not so obvious. I mean, how are you supposed to know that the guy that cut you off had a crying baby in the back seat or had a promotion meeting later on that he was late to? How are you supposed to know that? It's not salient, right? The situation. And when we don't know what the situation is, instead of just saying we don't know why they cut us off, we tend to assume that there was no situation that affected their behavior. And so we default to a personality or to an internal attribution. But furthermore, even if we knew what the situation was that was affecting other people's behavior, we don't really understand how situations affect people's behavior. I mean, if we did, you wouldn't be in this class, right? If it's obvious to everybody how situations affected our behavior, you wouldn't need a class like social psychology, which is all about how the situation affects our behavior. And so even if we're aware that there is some sort of situation, we don't really understand how that situation affects people's behavior. So we might, even if we knew there's a crying baby in the back seat and he was late to a promotion meeting, we may not realize how that can distract him to the point where he might cut us off. And as we've seen before as well, people tend to be mentally lazy. Again, we don't like to think if we don't have to. And again, it's really easy to make an internal attribution. It's really easy to say they did that because that's their personality. And it's a lot harder to think about the various situations that might have affected their behavior. And so if we're mentally lazy and we don't want to think about that all that much, we'll default to those internal attributions. And finally, this is kind of an overlooked point, I think, is that the English language is rich. It's full of terms that have to do with dispositions and personality, right? Why did someone do something? Because they're a nice person, they're an honest person, they're a generous person, they're trustworthy. We have all sorts of words that we use to make internal attributions. But we kind of lack words to make external attributions. Like, what word do we have that means influenced by a situation, right? So when this person cuts you off, it's really, really easy to say, you asshole, right? Because we have so many words to describe people's behavior. But even if we wanted to make a situational attribution, what would we say? Like, you get cut off and you say, you person who's influenced by the things that are going on around you. We don't even have a word for that, right? So because we lack a word for those situational attributions, we tend to default towards these easy internal attributions that we do in fact have words for. So now that you know about the fundamental attribution error, you should look for this in your daily life, because you will see this all the time, right? If you ask people why someone else did something, they'll almost always explain it in terms of their disposition or in terms of these internal causes, and they'll neglect how the situation might have affected other people's behavior as well. And you can use this information to better your own life. As I mentioned, when we get into fights with other people, we almost always make dispositional internal attributions for their behavior. You did this because you were uncaring and you were selfish. But to the extent that we can hold off on that and to think about how the situation might have affected their behavior, then maybe we won't fight with these other people as much. Maybe we'll start to understand and see things from their perspective. Okay, well, given that we engage in the fundamental attribution error, so when we explain other people's behavior, we explain in terms of dispositional causes. Well, actually, before I get there, I wanted to mention this one thing. So I mentioned that the name fundamental attribution error is sort of a misnomer. It's not exactly appropriately named. And part of the reason for this is because when this bias was initially discovered, it was discovered in Western culture. in the United States. That's where most social psychologists lived, especially at the time. And every study that they ran, you could easily find the fundamental attribution error. It's very, very reliable, this effect. And so researchers assumed that it was fundamental. However, later on in the 90s, people started to do more cross-cultural research, and they started to explore these phenomena in, for instance, Eastern collectivist cultures. And when they started to do that, what they discovered is that the fundamental attribution error doesn't occur nearly as frequently as in Eastern cultures and collectivist cultures as it does in Western individualist cultures. That's what I mean when I said that the name fundamental is not quite as fundamental as it first appeared. And I'll give you an example. This is a study that looked at two different cultures. They looked at an individualist culture, which is an American culture, and they looked at a more collectivist culture, which is an Asian Indian culture. And what they did is they looked at all sorts of attributions that people made to explain other people's behavior. And they categorized them as either being internal attributions, personal dispositional attributions, or external attributions. So what we're going to look at here is the proportion of all attributions that people made that were internal in nature. And they looked at this as a function of the age of people within that culture. So if you look first at the individualist cultures, what you find is this, that when we're young in these Western cultures, we tend to make relatively few internal attributions. But as we get older, over time, we learn to make more and more of these internal attributions. And that's because of the culture that we've grown up in. In individualist cultures, we learn as we grow up to explain other people's behavior in terms of their dispositions. And so as we get older and older, we make increasingly more internal attributions because we've learned through culture to do so. But this is not universal. In these Asian Indian cultures, they tend to start off at the same place. They make relatively few internal attributions as young children. And over time, they don't really make more and more internal attributions, because in collectivist cultures, they learn within those cultures that people do things because they're influenced by their environment. Remember that in collectivist cultures, they focus more on the interconnectedness between people. And as part of that, that means that we can understand how other people can influence us, or how the situation, how context can influence us. So they don't learn to make more and more internal attributions over time. As a consequence, people in Western cultures, like ours, are more likely to engage in the fundamental attribution error because the culture we're a part of teaches us to explain other people's behavior in terms of their disposition. And we can flip this. Instead of looking at the proportion of attributions that are internal, we can look at the proportion of attributions that are situational or external. And again, we can look at an American sample versus an Asian Indian sample. And if we start with the Western individualist American sample, what we find is that over time, again, we're not learning to make more and more situational attributions because our culture doesn't emphasize that. It doesn't teach us that about how situations might affect people's behavior. But Asian Indian cultures do show that, right? So again, they're starting off at a young age at roughly the same place, that people make roughly the same proportion of situational attributions. But as they get older and older, over time, they are learning through their culture to explain people's behavior in terms of the situation. Okay, so there's some pretty drastic cultural differences in terms of this tendency to engage in the fundamental attribution error. And partly on the basis of these findings, where we've discovered that this bias is not quite as fundamental as we thought, some researchers have renamed this concept into the correspondence bias. So if you ever see the term correspondence bias, it means the exact same thing as the fundamental attribution error. They just wanted to get away from the term fundamental because we've learned that it's not quite as fundamental. That being said, historically speaking, people mostly refer to it as the fundamental attribution error. So that's more likely the term you're more likely to see. Okay. So when we make attributions for other people's behavior, we tend to explain their behavior in terms of dispositional internal causes, right? But we also have to make attributions about our own behavior. Sometimes we have to explain why we did something. Now, if we were fair, then if we're explaining other people's behavior in terms of their personality, we should explain our own behavior in terms of our personality. That seems fair, right? But that's not what we tend to do. Instead, what we tend to do is exhibit a bias known as the actor-observer effect. What this means is that when we explain other people's behavior, we tend to explain it in terms of their disposition, their personality, internal causes. But when we explain our own behavior, we make excuses for ourselves. We often explain our own behavior in terms of the situation. So for instance, when someone else cuts you off on the highway, it's because they're an asshole. That's an internal attribution, right? When you cut someone else off on the highway, it's not because you're an asshole. No, it's because you got distracted by something else, right? You make a situational attribution for your own behavior. This is a little hypocritical in a sense, right? And that's what the actor-observer effect is this difference in how we explain other people's behavior versus how we explain our own behavior, right? If you trip, it's because you're clumsy. It's an internal attribution. If I trip, it's because something got in my way. That's an external attribution. This is, again, a very common attributional bias that most people in this culture exhibit. I'll give you a few examples of the actor-observer effect. Some researchers looked at convicted felons, people who were in prison, and they looked at their explanations for why they were incarcerated, right? So if they're in jail for, armed robbery or something. So what led you to armed robbery? And what typically happens is that the inmates explain their own behavior in terms of the situation. I was out drinking with a friend and they wanted to go rob these people, and so they influenced me, and they're basically explaining their behavior in terms of something external to them, right? Some situation led me to that behavior. On the other hand, when the researchers talked to the counselors of those inmates, like the psychologists and stuff that would talk to them, the counselors explain the inmates' behavior, not in terms of the situation, but in terms of their personality. They did that because that's part of their personality, something along those lines. Okay, this is a good question. So isn't this almost the same thing as the fundamental attribution error? This is a good question because people get confused between these two biases a lot. So here's the difference. The fundamental attribution error only refers to how we make attributions for other people's behavior, okay? So the fundamental attribution error says that we overestimate the dispositional internal causes of other people's behavior, and we neglect how the situation might have affected their behavior. That's it. The actor-observer effect says that although we do that for other people, we don't do that for ourselves. So the actor-observer effect is all about the difference between how we make attributions for other people's behavior in terms of internal causes and our own behavior in terms of external causes, okay? So they're very much related, but that's the fundamental difference between those two different biases. Okay, another line of evidence that's consistent with the existence of an actor-observer effect is that for a while you might have heard about Dear Abby letters. These are letters where people would write in to a columnist, her name was Dear Abby, basically. They would write in and ask for advice. So they outline their situation, here's what's going on, I need some advice, and then she would give them advice back. Some researchers analyzed these Dear Abby letters, and what they showed is that when people wrote in with explanations or with explanations for their own behavior, they usually tended to explain their own behavior in terms of the situation. But those same people, when explaining other people's behavior, would explain it in terms of their personality, these internal causes, consistent with the actor-observer effect. To what degree could you say the inmate's interpretation is true versus the counselor's? Yes, so neither of these biases, well, I shouldn't say that. I should say the actor-observer effect in general isn't really concerned with the truthfulness. In other words, it can happen either because we're biased about other people's behavior or because we're biased about our own behavior, okay, or both. It depends on the situation, right? Sometimes the counselors might have a better explanation. Sometimes the inmates might have a better explanation. The point is that we're both kind of biased. We're biased when we make attributions for other people's behavior, and we're also biased when we make attributions for our own behavior. In fact, I haven't really mentioned this, but we can tie this in with some other general ideas we've already talked about a few weeks ago, right? So the general theme that we want to have really high self-esteem, right, means that when we engage in negative behaviors, we want to blame other people, right? We don't want to take the blame because then we might have to lower our self-esteem. So as a consequence, when we're explaining our own behaviors, we often explain them, especially our negative ones, in terms of the situation so that our self-esteem doesn't have to drop. So part of the reason that the actor-observer effect exists is because of this fundamental need to maintain this high self-esteem. And so we make different types of attributions. Okay, so one more time, the difference between the fundamental attribution error and the actor observer effect. The fundamental attribution error is only when we're explaining other people's behavior. And the bias is that we tend to explain it almost completely in terms of internal causes, and we neglect external causes, how external causes might have affected their behavior. That's it, okay? So we over-attribute other people's behavior to their personality. The actor-observer effect says that we attribute other people's behavior to their personality, but our own behavior to the situation. That's the difference. All right, and finally, his third piece of evidence that's consistent with the actor-observer effect. Some researchers looked at pairs of college roommates, and they would separate them. And one at a time, they would ask each person, or I guess they'd give each person a list of a bunch of personality traits, honest, trustworthy, whatever. And then they would ask the participant to rate how often does this describe yourself and how often does it describe your roommate. And what they tend to show is that when people are making attributions about other people's behavior, they tend to say like, this person is very trustworthy and they're like that all the time, or they're untrustworthy and they're like that all the time. The point is that when making attributions about other people's behavior, they would tend to say that other person is always like that. But when making attributions about their own behavior, when they had to rate themselves in terms of how trustworthy you are, they would say things like, well, it depends. Sometimes I'm trustworthy and sometimes I'm not. Or if they had to rate themselves on honesty, well, with some people I'm on, like with my friends, I'm honest, with my family, I'm not honest. So basically people would say that it depends, like you can't describe me with just the term, it sort of depends on the situation, but they wouldn't say that for other people. For other people, they're always the same way. For me, it sort of depends on the situation. So it's kind of like we're acknowledging that our own behavior might differ from situation to situation, but we don't do that for other people. And I want to keep talking about this tendency that we have to make attributions for ourselves, because there's a third attributional bias on top of the fundamental attribution error, on top of the actor-observer effect, that I think is really interesting as well. And it has to do with how we make attributions for our own behavior. And this bias is something known as the over-justification effect. So here's the basic idea with the over-justification effect. Let's say there's an activity that you really enjoy doing for its own sake. That could be painting or dancing or singing or playing an instrument or playing a sport or whatever it is, whatever your hobby is. Just think about that. Whatever your hobby is that you intrinsically enjoy doing for its own sake, you find that intrinsically rewarding. Well, let's say that you then start to get paid for that same hobby. Okay, in other words, you receive an extrinsic reward, you get something for doing it. So you start to get paid to play sports, or you start to get paid for your paintings or whatever it is. When that happens, when we start to receive these extrinsic rewards, that tends to diminish our intrinsic motivation to perform those same activities. In more common language, we really like doing something, then we start to get paid for it, and that leads us to like doing that thing even less. And the reason this occurs is because there's an attributional bias going on. So let me describe sort of a classic study that showed this, and then we'll talk about how this relates to attributions per se. So in this study, researchers go into a school on 3 consecutive days. Okay? On day 1, they go to a school. These are like with grade school kids. On day 1, they go into the school with a bunch of colored markers. And they give the kids the markers, and they allow the kids to play with the markers as much as they want. And most of the kids really like playing with these colored markers. So they play with them a lot. Okay, so what the researchers have established on day 1 is that these kids have an intrinsic motivation to play with markers. They really like doing it. Okay, that's all day 1 is. The researchers then come back on day 2. On day 2, they randomly assign these kids to one of 3 conditions. So in one condition, they simply allow the kids to play with the markers as much as they want, just like on day 1. Okay, that's our control condition. In the second condition, the kids are told at the beginning of the day, we have these markers here for you, and if you play with them, then you're going to receive a reward at the end of the day. you're going to get a blue ribbon and this good player certificate. Okay, so you're going to get this reward for playing with the markers. In the third condition, the kids are allowed to play with the markers as much as they want. And at the end of the day, they get a surprise reward. And the surprise reward is a blue ribbon and this good player certificate. So we've got three conditions. We've got the control condition, who are never given a reward, an expected reward condition, kids who are told that if in the morning that if they play with the markers, they'll get a reward, and an unexpected reward condition, kids that are allowed to play with the markers and only then are given a surprise reward. The researchers then come back on day 3. You can imagine, by the way, on day 2, everyone plays with the markers a lot, okay? Then the researchers come back on day 3. And on day 3, no rewards are given to any of the kids. Instead, there are markers there and the kids are just allowed to play with the markers as much as they want. And so the researchers are measuring on day 3 how much time the kids spend playing with the markers. And that's what I'm going to show you on the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to show you the percent of time the kids spend playing with the markers on day 3 as a function of which of the 3 conditions they're randomly assigned to on day 2. And we're going to start on the right side of the graph and going over these results. Okay, so if you look first at this control condition, okay, kids who receive no reward on day 2. On day 3, they still play with the markers a significant proportion of the time. Okay, they still liked playing with the markers. In other words, this measurement we're getting on day 3 is basically a measurement of how much the kids like playing with the markers. So the kids in the no reward control condition, they really like playing with the markers on day 3. Okay. Then if we look at the unexpected reward condition, these are the kids who on day 2 were allowed to play with the markers, and at the end of the day, they were given a surprise reward. On day 3, they also still like playing with the markers. Okay, so both of these 2 conditions still have intrinsic motivation to play with the markers. But what's most interesting is this third condition. The kids who received the expected reward, the kids who on day 2 in the morning were told, if you play with the markers, you will get a reward at the end of the day. Then that's what happened. Then on day 3, the researchers come back and allow the kids to play with the markers. And suddenly these kids don't want to play with the markers anymore, right? They spend a lot less time playing with the markers on day 3. In other words, they have lost their intrinsic motivation to play with the markers. By getting this expected reward on day 2, this blue ribbon and the good player certificate, that undermined their intrinsic motivation to play with the markers on day 3. And the question is, why does this happen? Well, what you've got to do is put yourself into the mindset of these kids, okay? Especially these expected reward kids. So imagine that on day 2, you're told in the morning, if you play with the markers, you get a reward. So you play with the markers, you get a reward at the end of the day. And on day 3, the researchers come back and they allow you to play with the markers again. And you're thinking to yourself, okay, well, how much do I like playing with these markers? Well, let's see. Yesterday, I played with the markers, but I was getting a reward to do so. And I knew I was getting a reward to do so. So when I played with the markers on day 2, I must have only done it because of the reward. And if that's the case, then I'm not receiving a reward today on day 3. So why would I play with the markers? And so they spend less time playing with the markers. What these kids have done, in other words, is they've made a mistaken attribution for why they played with the markers on day 2. They mistakenly believed that the only reason they played with the markers on day 2 was for the reward. They attributed their behavior to this extrinsic motivation. And because they're no longer receiving the reward on day 3, they think there's no point to playing with the markers anymore. But notice that the kids in the unexpected reward condition, they don't go through the same process because they're thinking, well, yesterday I played with markers on day 2 and I got a reward, but I didn't know I was getting the reward until the end of the day. So obviously I didn't play with the markers for the rewards. I didn't know I was getting one. So I must have played with them on day 2 because I really like playing with the markers. And if that's the case, I still really like playing with markers. So they play with the markers a lot. You can think of these findings as being very much related to self-perception theory. Remember, self-perception theory says when we don't know what our true attitudes are, we think about our past behavior and we come to rational conclusions. And that's sort of what's happening here. The kids in the expected reward condition are saying, how much do I like playing with markers? well, I played with markers yesterday, but I was promised a reward, so I guess I only did it for the reward. It's this very sort of almost logical process, right? The problem is that that attribution they're making was mistaken. They didn't just play with the markers for the reward. They played with them because they really liked them, but they mistakenly attributed the reason for their past behavior to this extrinsic reward, which undermined their intrinsic motivation to play with the markers on day 3. Okay, I hope that's clear to everybody. Okay, so what's happening is this sort of thought process, okay, where the kids are thinking, I must have only played with the markers on day 2 because I received a reward, not because I like them. And so they came to the wrong conclusion that they didn't actually like playing with the markers. And yes, you can ask a question. Absolutely. Let me unmute you. Hold on.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
So this isn't directly related to that that experiment, but I wanted to see how it relates to the topic. So given a situation where, I don't know if you can relate to this, but let's say your mother tells you to take out the trash, right? But you're already on your way to take out the trash, and you wanted to take out the trash, but once she says take out the trash, all of a sudden you don't want to do it anymore.
Yep.
Is that the same type of effect, or is that different, or how does that relate to that?
No, that's a little different, although you're right that that is an actual phenomenon. So we're going to talk about this later in the course, but that's due to something known as psychological reactance, where the basic idea, so again, we'll come back to this later on, but the basic idea is that we like the feeling that we are free to make our own decisions. And when someone else tells us to do something, we don't like the idea that other people can control us. So we'll often rebel against what they're telling us to do to sort of prove to ourselves that we're in control of ourselves, right? So as soon as someone tells us to do something, all of a sudden we don't want to do it because that's a way for us to exert a freedom that we feel is being taken away. That's due to something a little bit different. It's not an attributional bias. It's due to this other thing that we'll talk more about in the course. Okay. There's a story that I don't know if it's in your textbooks or not. It might be. But there's a story about a man who uses the overjustification effect to his advantage. And so the story goes like this. This man owns a store, and the front of the store are these big plate glass windows. And he had a problem because these kids kept coming to his store and throwing rocks through his windows, and it was getting really expensive for him to replace them. So I think most people in that situation would go and yell at the kids and try to force them not to come back, right? To get really angry at them. But he used a little bit of social psychology instead. So what he did is he went out to the kids next time they came around, and he said, whoa, don't run away. Actually, you know what? I actually really like what you're doing here. I like that you're throwing rocks through my windows. In fact, I like it so much that if you come back tomorrow and throw rocks through my windows, I'll pay you each a quarter. And the kids are thinking, well, we're going to do it for free anyway. So yeah, of course, if you're going to pay us to do it, of course we'll come back tomorrow. So the kids come back tomorrow, throw rocks through the guy's windows again. The guy runs out to them, says, guys, I love what you're doing. I really want you to come back tomorrow, throw rocks through my windows. And if you do so, I'll give you each a dime. The problem is I don't have as much money today. So I can only pay you a dime tomorrow. The kids are thinking, okay, well, it's not as good as a quarter, but it's still something. So they come back the next day, they throw rocks through his windows again. The man runs out one more time to the kids and says, guys, I love what you're doing. You're doing a great job smashing my windows. I want you to come back tomorrow and throw rocks through my windows again. The only problem is I'm out of money, so I can't pay you. And the kids take a look at this man and say, well, if you're not going to pay us, why would we throw rocks through your windows? And they leave and never come back. Now, what's happened here is that the shop owner has used the overjustification effect. What he has done is he has gone to these kids who were initially intrinsically motivated to throw rocks through his windows, and he started to pay them. He gave them an extrinsic motivator, an extrinsic reward. And the kids start thinking that the only reason they're throwing rocks through the windows is because they're getting paid. So when he therefore takes away that payment later on, the kids who now have mistakenly come to the conclusion that the only reason they're throwing rocks through the windows is because of the money, they start thinking, well, if I'm not getting paid, why would I do it? And they never come back again. Okay, so that's a good example of the overjustification effect in action. And there are a lot of implications, I think, of the overjustification effect, and I'll give you a couple. I think it's a natural tendency that parents might have, is that if they want their kids to succeed in schools, then one way to do so would be to reward them when they bring home a report card with all A's or something, right? That's understandable why that would happen. The problem is that by rewarding kids, let's say paying kids if they bring home a good report card, you might be accidentally playing into the overjustification effect, because the kids are going to start thinking that the only reason there's any point in getting good grades is because of this extrinsic reward that they're getting. And at some point, you're going to stop rewarding kids for good grades. Maybe the kids go away to college, for instance. They don't get money every time they bring home, every time they get good grades in their college classes anymore, right? But now the kids who have thought, well, the only reason I have for getting good grades is because of the reward. If I'm no longer being rewarded for bringing home good grades, then why would I care about bringing home good grades, right? So by rewarding your kids with this extrinsic motivator for bringing home good grades, you might have led them to engage in this attributional bias. You might have accidentally led them to think that the only reason they're getting good grades is because of that reward. And you might have undermined their intrinsic motivation to do well in school, to learn. In fact, I would argue that that happens all the time. In fact, grades themselves are, in a sense, an extrinsic reward for learning. And if you think that the only reason you're learning, the only reason you come to class, the only reason you listen to me is because that'll lead you to do better on an exam, then what you're effectively doing is you have come to the conclusion that you only care about learning because of this extrinsic reward, the grades. Whereas in reality, you might have intrinsic motivation to actually learn in your classes because it makes you a better person to know these things, right? But because you're constantly being rewarded with grades, that undermines your intrinsic motivation. And you can think, like, if I had a lecture and I told you guys none of this lecture was going to be on the exam, you're never going to be tested on it, I have a feeling the majority of you, maybe the large majority of you, would just simply not show up to that lecture. Part of the reason being because you might think that the only reason you go to lectures is to get a good grade in the class, right? So why would you go to a free lecture if it's not going to benefit you in any way? And this sort of thing happens all the time. When I was a kid, which is a long time ago, I remember playing in this sort of local soccer league. And I remember that some of the other coaches of other teams, when their kids won a soccer game, the coach would take them out for ice cream. Now, I was never on those teams. I was always on the teams where the coaches didn't take us out for ice cream. So I was always jealous of the kids that got to go to ice cream. Now, the coaches might have thought that by rewarding kids with ice cream, that would increase the kids' motivation to play well in soccer. What is likely to have happened, though, is those coaches might have accidentally led these kids to fall prey to the overjustification effect, where suddenly these kids think the only reason they're doing well, the only reason they're trying to play well in soccer is because of this extrinsic reward. And the next year, when they're on a different league, different team with a different coach who doesn't take them out for ice cream, they think, well, why would I play hard? Why would I practice? Why would I try if I'm not going to get rewarded every time I win? So what these coaches might have done is accidentally undermined these kids' intrinsic motivation to play soccer. Okay, so you can see that that's an attributional bias because people are mistakenly attributing their own behavior to an extrinsic reward as opposed to an intrinsic one. Okay, so just to summarize the section then on attributions, we have a natural tendency to make attributions for other people's behavior as well as our own behavior. It's almost uncomfortable to not try to explain why someone did something or why you did something. We saw that when we looked at the section on introspection, is that when you ask people why they like something, almost invariably they will come up with an answer. They won't say, I don't know, even though that might be the most accurate answer, but they'll almost invariably come up with an answer because we have this natural tendency to make these attributions. Sometimes we can make rational attributions. We have that capability. And that's what Kelly's attribution theory is all about, right? Is gathering all the relevant information in order to form the most informed attribution possible. So we can sometimes do that, but we don't always do that. Some of our attributions are biased. Many of our attributions are biased. This is what came out in social cognition when social cognition took over in the 1980s. And we've seen that people can behave somewhat irrationally. We engage in things like the fundamental attribution error, the actor-observer effect, and we'll sometimes make mistaken attributions for our own behavior, the overjustification effect. And note as well that the overjustification effect is kind of consistent with this idea we've talked about before, that we don't have this introspective awareness for why we do things. If we had introspective awareness, if we knew the reasons for our behaviors, we would never see the overjustification effect, because we would know that, for instance, in the study that I described to you, these kids would know that on day 2, they played with markers because they really liked them. They didn't play with them for the reward, even though they were promised that reward. They played with them because they really liked them. And if we had introspective awareness, we would know that, and we would never see the overjustification effect. It's the very fact that we lack that introspective awareness that leads us to engage in things like self-perception theory, where we try to come up with a rational conclusion, an inference about why we did something in the past. And those inferences that we make can be biased, can be mistaken, as we've seen with the overjustification effect. All right, we've got about 4 minutes left. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to take them right now. When is the next exam? It's the week after spring break. I can't remember the exact date of that, but it's the week after spring break, which is a couple weeks, I think. You got it. Any other questions? Okay, well, if there are no other questions, I think it makes sense to stop things here. So again, on Wednesday, that'll also be over Zoom. And again, remember that we're going to be doing part 2 of the extra credit study. Let me just stop this. Part 2 of the extra credit study that we started last week. So if you want a couple extra bonus points, make sure you're in class on Wednesday over Zoom. Okay. All right, guys. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you then. Have a good day.